and welcome to the Illinois LawCast. I'm your host, Chris Davies, and this is going to be a little bit different episode. We're going to do a deep dive on a hot legal issue. I'm joined by Lena Shapiro, a professor and director of the First Amendment Clinic here at the University of Illinois College of Law. And we're going to talk a little bit about the TikTok ban that was recently upheld by the Supreme Court. Lena, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. For a little background, TikTok is a social media app that specializes in short-form video. It is owned by the Chinese company ByteDance. Could you tell us a little bit about why Congress felt the need to ban it?
Yes. So the act that we're talking about, the Protecting Americans from Foreign Controlled Applications Act, was passed to purportedly address national security concerns. So it barred the use of apps that were controlled by, quote unquote, foreign adversaries of the United States, which includes China. TikTok, that you were giving us an introduction about specifically, has about 170 million monthly United States users, which is a number that even I was shocked by. The platform's content is determined by a recommendation engine or algorithm originally developed by ByteDance, which is a China-based company that is TikTok's ultimate parent. And then, although subsequently TikTok created a United States subsidiary and partnered with Oracle to handle all U.S. operations and data security, ByteDance retained significant control over the platform's global operations and the source code development. And so in response to national security concerns as a result of ByteDance retaining that significant control, concerns were raised about Chinese influence over TikTok, and both the Trump and Biden administrations attempted various measures to address these risks, and the result was this act.
And what did the Supreme Court say when they released their decision recently to uphold the law and let the ban go into effect?
So there were a couple of findings or rulings that the Supreme Court had to make. First, the court determined that intermediate scrutiny applied because the law was content neutral. So they had to decide whether heightened scrutiny or intermediate scrutiny would apply. And that was the first sort of significant decision. And we'll get into substantively why that's important. The court found that the law targeted TikTok not based on the content of the speech, which would have triggered heightened scrutiny, but because TikTok wasn't targeted based on the content of the speech on the platform, but rather because of China's ability to access sensitive data from the 170 million users in the United States, the law was subjected to a lower level of scrutiny than if it had a targeted speech or content of speech itself. And then the court went into the actual sort of logistics of the law. So they said the provisions of the TikTok law, subject to the less rigorous test, required the court to look at whether the provisions advanced an important government interest that is not related to the suppression of free expression and does not restrict substantially more speech than is necessary to do so. And the court concluded that the provisions satisfied that test. The court wrote that there was no dispute that the government, quote, has an important and well-grounded interest in preventing China from collecting the personal data of tens of millions of U.S. TikTok users. And the court further recognized and wrote that the record reflects that China has engaged in extensive and years-long efforts to accumulate structured data sets, in particular on U.S. persons, to support its intelligence and counterintelligence operations.
So you mentioned the issues of the scrutiny and what level of scrutiny, and this comes back to the First Amendment, correct?
Correct.
Do you think that the First Amendment was applied correctly in this case?
And so the court recognized that there were certain First Amendment implications that they had to address. And so I mentioned the first decision they had to make was whether the law was content neutral or content based. And if it was content based, it would have triggered a higher level of scrutiny. I disagree with the decision to apply intermediate scrutiny. I think the law should have been subjected to heightened scrutiny, even though, the Supreme Court was careful to say that this was a narrow holding in a very particular circumstance for this particular company, this company being TikTok, given the national security implications that they recognized. But when you have a content-based law or a regulation, it discriminates against speech based on the substance of what that speech is. And in contrast, a content-neutral law applies to speech also, but without regard to what the substance is. So there's a different reason for the government passing the law that doesn't relate to the content of what's actually being said. And so in First Amendment free speech law, content-based and viewpoint-based laws are evaluated under strict scrutiny. And there, the government has to show that there is a compelling or very strong interest in the law and that the law is either very narrowly tailored or is the least speech restrictive means available to the government. And that is a significantly higher standard that is applied to a content neutral law, which wouldn't reflect a preference for certain content or viewpoints. And there, the government only has to show that the law furthers an important versus a compelling government interest that is unrelated to the suppression of free expression and does not burden substantially more speech than necessary to further that interest, as opposed to being the least restrictive means. So there were less hurdles for this law to jump through when you apply intermediate or lower level of scrutiny. And that, I think, affected the outcome significantly because it made it easier for the Supreme Court to find that the law complies or is not unconstitutional. And generally speaking, very few laws that are found to be content-based or viewpoint-based survive strict scrutiny. And so once you make that first decision, it affects significantly the trajectory of the case. The Supreme Court found and concluded that, quote, Congress has determined that divestiture is necessary to address the well-supported national security concerns regarding TikTok's data collection practices and relationship with a foreign adversary. That's part of the information that the court used to determine that this was a content-neutral law and it wasn't actually targeting the speech that exists on the platform. But one of the issues with this case is that the record about what the law is targeting is not particularly well developed. Congress did not really create a public record that explains or provided evidence about why such a severe encroachment on free speech, I mean, you're talking about removing a platform from 170 million users, was needed to address a very real and serious problems. There were statements from lawmakers that revealed illegitimate intent in passing the law and an attempt to suppress disfavored speech and really kind of non-specific concerns about national security. So when you're alleging that there is a national security risk, you have to explain what that is. It's not enough to just issue a blanket statement and say that. And Judge Gorsuch specifically wrote in his concurrence that the case has moved through the Supreme Court quickly and that he did not have the kind of certainty that he would like to have about the arguments and the record before us. And he said, all I can say is that at this time and under these constraints, the problem appears real and the response to it not unconstitutional. And then the Supreme Court, of course, says it's a very narrow holding. I think there was evidence of the fact that the platform was targeted specifically because of the content that was hosted on TikTok. And therefore, I think strict scrutiny should have applied. And I don't know that the outcome would have been the same if it had.
Now, despite the outcome and despite his previous statements, President Trump has come out in favor of not upholding the ban, basically not doing what the Supreme Court said is correct.
Well, so the sale deadline was January 19th, which was the day before the inauguration. And so practically speaking, enforcement of the ban fell to now President Trump and his administration. And on his first day in office, he issued an executive order which instructed the Attorney General to, quote, not take any action to enforce the act for a period of 75 days from today to allow the Trump administration an opportunity to determine the appropriate course forward in an orderly way that protects national security while avoiding an abrupt shutdown of a communications platform used by millions of Americans. So currently, under federal law, it does remain illegal for U.S. companies like internet hosting services and app stores to maintain, distribute, and update TikTok, as the platform remains owned by the Chinese company ByteDance. But the Attorney General has been instructed not to enforce the act for 75 days to give the Trump administration time to review next steps, which practically speaking leaves the CEOs of these companies and their general counsels very nervous about hosting an app that could subject them to punishment after the 75 days or depending on what happens. I understand that as we sit here today, there are talks for American investors to purchase a majority stake in TikTok. I obviously don't know the status of those sales or what the progress is, but we know that currently that's what the executive order reflects, a state enforcement for 75 days. And then we'll see what happens after that. Yeah.
So do you think we've seen the final outcome of this case? And does it portend changes for social media more broadly?
I don't think we have that. As I mentioned before, I don't think the record was fully developed in terms of what the law was attempting to target. There was an amicus brief or friend of the court brief that was filed before the Supreme Court by several groups, including the Institute for Justice, the First Amendment Lawyers Association, and FIRE, among others, which argued specifically in response to the national security argument that, and I quote, no published legislative findings or other official public records attempt to explain or substantiate any real or serious problem that supports severely encroaching upon millions of Americans' rights to speak and receive information, nor was there any serious attempt to show the ban would effectively address the asserted risks. The legislative record showing the law's purpose reveals illegitimate intent to suppress disfavored speech and generalized concerns about data privacy under the general umbrella of national security. And the brief gave some examples of what they believe what that illegitimate intent was. The brief specifically cited, for example, the House Energy and Commerce Committee report stated that the act was in part intended to prevent TikTok and other regulated communication platforms from pushing misinformation, disinformation, and propaganda on the American public, notwithstanding that foreign actors could do that on other platforms. The act's co-sponsor, Representative Mike Gallagher, cited the propaganda threat as the greater concern about TikTok. And when this case was pending before the D.C. Circuit, the government argued that the act was necessary to address the possibility that the People's Republic of China might shape the content that American users receive, including promotion of content that aligns with PRC interests. And so I think we need a more developed record to really get at the purpose of what the law is attempting to do. And then you can determine whether it truly is content neutral or whether it is content based. Then you can determine whether the law can survive strict scrutiny depending on what it actually does, unless it's sold before the next 75 days.
Right. And then this is all just a
then we move on to the next issue. Yes.
Well, thank you very much, Lena. I appreciate you taking the time from this busy start of the semester to break this down.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to this special episode of the Illinois LawCast. If there's a topic you would like to hear our experts at the College of Law discuss on the podcast, please send your suggestions to podcast@law.illinois.edu. This podcast is available on all major platforms as well as on YouTube. Subscribe so that you may be notified when we release a new episode. This episode was mixed, recorded, and edited by me, Chris Davies. Special thanks to Kelly Moss and Krista Getke for their help with all aspects of the podcast. Thank you again for listening. See you next time.